Maybe today you clicked onto this video as a parent who's been waiting on a wait list for a while to get your child into therapy. And now that you have, there's just something about the therapist's recommendations or about the process of therapy that just doesn't gel with you. Or maybe you are a teacher or someone working with this child who actually was the one that recommended the child for therapy. And now that they are receiving it, it doesn't feel like it hits the mark or something feels off. Today, we are going to be talking all about what to do if you don't feel like you agree with the recommendations or the process of therapy. I'm going to be taking my over a decade experience working with children and families as an occupational therapist and kind of taking a deep dive on the things that I would recommend that you move forward with, like some of the steps that you can take. And I hope that this gives you a better understanding of what the process of therapy generally would look like, what you can expect, and sometimes how to move past certain things to focus on certain other things. Now, if you are a teacher or someone working with young children, I have a checklist down below which you may love. Checklist on current and up-to-date best practices for high quality early childhood education. And you can find that linked down below. So before we dive into actually what I think that a parent or a teacher or someone that works with children that doesn't feel like therapy is meeting the mark for the child or just feels like something is off, the steps that you should be taking that I think will really transform the dynamic of therapy, I want to just give you a breakdown as a therapist, what kind of our ideas are going into therapy, like a bit of a bird's eye view, what therapy is all about. So the first one is that therapy, and when I say therapy, I'm talking about physiotherapists, occupational therapists, speech and language pathologist. Of course, there are other therapies that come around that, but I'm really talking about therapy that is looking at your child's development. And the type of therapy that we're talking about today is generally early intervention. That's what we're speaking about in broad topics. I think that some of what we're saying could definitely be applied to therapists working within school settings, receiving therapy as part of a different program or disability. Or there's many ways that this could be applied, but the framework that I'm using specifically is talking about therapy, receiving therapy, or a child that you work with receiving therapy around early intervention and around their overall development. So the first one is that therapy is often considered through a lens of remediation. Sometimes I see a therapist recommending a certain tool or approach to a family or within a school setting. And that approach might seem really different to the pedagogy of the education system. It might also seem different to the style of parenting that the parent has. So I want you to think about this in terms of that these tools that therapy often gives you to take home aren't necessarily tools that are for forever. This is not saying that you can never parent in that style if it's different, or that you'll be continuing to do this kind of approach with your child for forever. This is really about this time period where we are like kind of working towards a sprint to develop a certain level of your child's development or a certain skill, might be using tools that are different to the tools that we'll be using in the long run. So I'm going to give you some examples because I know that sounds a bit vague, but one that I see happening over and over and over again is in terms of speech therapy. Now, again, I'm not a speech language pathologist, so this is something that I've just experienced on the outside as being an occupational therapist. And if you are a speech and language pathologist and you have a disagreement here, just post it down below because I'd love to hear. But I see that there's often this recommendation given about don't close everything really tightly and make things not independently accessible to your child so that they have to come to you to ask for help. Now, this is often given with children when they are pre-verbal. So we're not talking about a child that is already speaking 200 words and is we're just, working on a certain pronunciation or oral motor skills or something like that. This is a child generally, how I see it recommended is that this is for a child that we're really wanting to build up those pre-verbal skills. So we're really wanting to push that they start speaking. And one of the best ways to get children to start speaking is when they need something, when they have an innate desire for something and they are wanting it. So they will come and say a word to you. So what often happens is that the therapist is recommending if they come and they point to something, maybe for some level of children that's good, but for other children we're wanting that they actually have to say something like open, please, or they may have a specific word that they are instructing that they want the child to learn to say. Now, if you look on the pedagogy side of this, in terms of the educational philosophy, many of our educational philosophies are based around independent initiation from the child. And for example, in a Montessori approach, we'll have open shelf system where a child can go and choose what they want and take it down. And these two seem to really clash. If a parent has been following Montessori, or a child is in a Montessori school and they tell them, the instruction is to close everything, so the child needs to ask for help, it can seem like, did you miss the philosophy here? So I want to encourage you that recommendation doesn't mean that your child, once they are speaking and able to communicate their basic needs, that they won't fit well into an independent kind of system within Montessori. This is approach for a specific goal. So it's focused on something, getting our children to speak. Some of the conflict can come in here because we're in the pedagogy or this parenting style, we're thinking what do you think, that children can't be independent and that things should be inaccessible and we're disrespecting a child. And actually it's like looking at an orange and calling it an apple. It's not understanding the bigger goal to just move up one functional step. So the first thing that I want you to consider is really that the tools are for a season and that they often are sprint tools. So another example of when I've done this in therapy and experienced this as kind of the parent receiving it as not this isn't our parenting style, was specifically around picky eating. Now, one of the beginning frameworks that we work on when we have a child that is an extreme picky eater, and when I say extreme picky eating, I'm talking about a child that we are genuinely concerned for their nutrition. This is actually a health, not just you could be healthier concern, but a genuine health concern for this child's development, for their brain development, for their physical growth. So when this child specifically was around 4.5 and they were basically living off of baby formula, which doesn't meet the nutritional requirements for a growing child. So it was really a serious need to be doing therapy. And one of the places that we start with therapy is that a child learns that there are eating times. It's one of the foundational pillars. We do this so naturally at home, right? That we have a meal time, and maybe the practices around meal times are stricter or less strict, more flexible within certain families. But we often have a kind of thing that we do follow almost every time around getting a child to understand that this is now eating time. So with this child specifically, because he was such a picky eater and it had been such a difficult journey, they had grown into this habit of spoons kind of just arriving from the abyss to this child's mouth. So there were two foods that he would agree to eat, not enough to actually sustain himself. But the parent was really concerned that if that time that she was kind of following him around and putting a spoon in his mouth and for 2 hours kind of walking after him with a spoon, that if that didn't happen, the child wouldn't eat. That is a genuine concern. That is not, I'm not overriding that. That is a genuine concern. At the same time, we also have the genuine concern of that this child actually does need to learn to eat. So one of the first places that we started with therapy was not offering foods, not doing any sensory treatment around the mouth, but getting the child to sit down at a structured eating time and grading that up. So it started off with a minute, 2 minutes. Now, as a therapist, I feel like this is a completely valid goal. On the other side, this was something that there had to be a lot of kind of discussion with around the parent, because it felt like this didn't match the philosophy of a free-spirited child or a home that allowed the child to be accepted exactly as they were, right? So I just wanted to bring this up as an example. The good news is that this child progressed a lot in therapy, and that after initial period that wasn't super fun. It wasn't like we did only glitter and rainbows and he decided to sit at the table because everything was fun and perfect and lovely. It felt uncomfortable in the beginning, but that little step of overcoming that initial discomfort was really, really beneficial for this child's therapy, incredibly beneficial. So I want to just break that down for you in terms of whether you are a teacher or a parent that's receiving therapy, and you might not feel that those first steps of therapy feel super comfortable. Just remember that this is like an idea of a sprint. And this is something, we're going to talk about this later, but really discuss this with your therapist. Like, discuss, is this a long-term, this is what we will be doing forever kind of treatment tool? Or is this we just need to get to step 2, and then, you know, this tool that we're using might fade away. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when we are looking at therapy, we often, as the people that are being told like what we should be doing in the classroom as a teacher or as a parent, we can feel like the tool is the focus. But actually, when we look at what makes therapy really successful for children, one of the biggest things is the relationship with the therapist. So if you are sending your child to therapy and you feel like in the beginning, like, well, they don't really have much of a relationship, or my child's shy, they don't want to go in, all of this, I would say give it like 4 to 6 sessions, because it's very natural that in the beginning there would be a little bit of learning each other. But you'll be able to see within the therapy dynamic if the therapist has a kind of connection with your child that elicits some kind of new type of engagement from your child. Now, I've worked with children that they have received therapy from like 10 or 15 different therapists. And when we sat in a meeting with, say, 5 of these therapists and myself, we saw that each of us elicited something very different from the child. So the way that they interacted within the therapy space was very different. And this is a great thing. This is a really, really great thing. I also know for myself as a therapist that there are some children that I can work with that, they can be with another therapist and the therapy can fall completely flat, and they can be with me and my kind of temperament and my dynamic and really thrive. And the opposite is exactly true as well. There are some therapists that are much more reserved, more gentle, different in the way that they interact with children, that do better with a certain type of temperament of child. And that is something really important to consider in the therapy. So often I hear parents kind of thinking about how their child is receiving therapy and saying like, oh, well, it's not like, it's not fun enough, or it's not using this thing that I saw on some social media post or something like that. Like, I would encourage you to, and also wanting results really soon, which is not necessarily what the trajectory of therapy is always going to be, that we would see results within a few weeks. Like, often it does take a little bit of a while, and then often we have like a big spurt, depending on the child, depending on the situation. That's not a cut and dry thing, but definitely look at the relationship. That's one of the key things that we want to, from the outside, be kind of seeing if it is the right fit for a child. But again, I would say 4 to 6 sessions before we even make any kind of judgment calls on that, because it will be different for each thing. So I also wanted to say here, often when we're thinking about therapy, we've got a recommendation that does feel like weird, or it doesn't gel well, or it doesn't feel easy to do. We can think about like quitting therapy or changing therapists. And I would encourage you to count the costs of that. I know if this is your child that you've sent for therapy, or even if you're a teacher that you have recommended that this child receives some kind of therapy, that there is a huge cost involved with not continuing. There's a huge cost involved in getting to the point that you've actually started a relationship, started a therapeutic process. Of course, therapy, whether it's physio, OT, or speech and language therapy, is expensive, and all the associated therapies. But when we choose to not continue with therapy, when we say like, this process is too hard, like it feels really uncomfortable, we need to first consider the cost of what will happen if we allow that the gap between our child's development to their peers continues to grow. And I say that not with a judgment, or I don't even say this in ease, because I know that as parents, we have not just this one child in front of us, we have like the lives of all of the people within our family that we are kind of holding and trying to balance all of those balls. I just wanted to say that I do understand that, but also consider the cost of not continuing with any therapy that has been recommended or that has been started. And also, as then somebody that's working within a school structure, consider the cost on that child if you choose not to do the recommendations or to have a discussion about how the recommendations could be changed, or what tools or different tools could be used in place of a recommendation that doesn't work. We're going to get to that. I'm rushing ahead. So the last thing that I wanted to say, and this really leads into it, is that when we are negotiating something, we want to negotiate, we want to be 100% clear that we are together and in a team on the goals for the child. But tools can always be negotiated. So for example, I used the example before that speech therapists often give the recommendation to close a container or to have things less accessible, so a child needs to request that you would open it. Now that's a tool. The goal is to increase verbal skills, right? To increase speech, to be more communicative. If we can agree on the goal, the tool, you might say this, like in a Montessori school, this is a really difficult tool for us to embrace without changing the whole setup of our school. So the tool, let's negotiate. Let's look at how we can use this tool maybe in different places, not on the shelves, but maybe when it comes to food or different things like that. But the goal of supporting this child's development, we need to be on board with, right? If the goal is something that is like completely unrelated, or you don't understand how it's related to the overall functioning of the child, that you need to get clear on. Let's get to the actual strategy of what I recommend for parents or teachers to be doing when they just feel like the therapy recommendations are a bit off or they don't know how to fit them in. And the first one is to leave social media facts at the door. There's so much information that we take in on a daily basis, and some of it is based on like a really specific thinking, a really specific style of parenting or specific pedagogy, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that thing that we saw on somebody's social media, even if they have doctor in front of their name, even if there's a research paper on it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best fit for this child. Remember that when you are sending a child to therapy, the person that is working with them has a huge amount of experience and knowledge and education around the specific thing that they're working on. You don't come to an occupational therapist, for example, and ask them about medication, right? Because it's not our area of expertise. And it's the same way you might see a post from even a pediatrician about a certain area of development. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% an authoritative piece of nugget of information for your child. Like the therapist that is seeing your child understands them. They do thorough assessments. These assessments are very, very well researched. They're very in depth, and they give the therapist a much bigger idea than anything that we can pull a piece of fruit off of a social media post. So leave that stuff at the door and recognize that the person that is working with your child, or the child that you've recommended that they work with, is a professional. The second thing is read the reports. Every therapist, when we start working with a child, we do some kind of informal evaluation or a standardized assessment. Now, I want you to read those reports and try to break down exactly what is being said in those reports. So when it comes to looking onto therapy, you'll be seeing that you're looking onto three main areas. The first is the handling of your child, or the child that you've recommended. So this will be the relationship stuff. Is the therapy engaging them? How are they being engaged? Do they want to go in? How is the therapist encouraging them to come into the therapy room? How are they playing with them? That's all the handling stuff. The second thing would be the actual assessment that the therapist has done and the goals that they've set. And then the third thing would be the tools and the methods that they are recommending to use to meet those goals. Those will be tools and methods within the therapy setting, as well as the program that they give for the school setting as well, or preschool setting, as well as the home setting. So if you can understand those three things, we're not then just lambasting, oh, therapy doesn't work, it's not good for my child, or I don't like it, or it doesn't feel good, the child doesn't want to go. We're saying this is a handling issue. So we've done the assessment, we've got the assessment done, and we understand that there is an issue with fine motor skills, for example, but the handling, it's just not a good fit. We've waited 6 sessions, the handling is off, right? That then we understand what our concern is. If we are saying, again, like this Montessori example, the tool that's been recommended to use in the home setting doesn't feel right, again, this doesn't mean therapy is out the window. It means let's renegotiate that one small tool. if the assessment doesn't feel like it understood what the original concern was, or that the child has been measured on like a different kind of milestone, or the assessment itself, like you've come in and said that I feel that my child has some delay in gross motor skills, and the therapist is saying the gross motor skills are totally fine, but the visual perception skills need work, or something like that, and you can't understand that, or it doesn't seem like the right fit, then we understand we need to go back to like assessment and goals, right? Having this breakdown, reading the reports, having a breakdown of exactly what is going on in the therapy setting will also help you to negotiate better, which is the third point. And this is really the most important, that when we as therapists work with a child, what we consider is that the child has a team around them. You know, the parent is part of that team. We call it an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary team, but really each member of that team is working together. We know as therapists that we spend a short time with a child and they are with their teachers or within education centers more, and they're also with their parents more than we will ever be able to provide in terms of therapy. So that is why we give these instructions, like do this at home or do this also within school. And when the instructions don't feel like the right fit, or they don't feel like a possible fit or plausible fit, that's when we need to be coming back to that teamwork. You know, today, for a lot of children that are seeing multiple therapists, how we structure this within educational systems is that the therapists work within the school. So for example, myself as an occupational therapist, a lot of the work that I will do within a preschool is not necessarily one-on-one or even group treatment, but it is about getting the whole system of how the preschool engages with this child to also pair up to the therapeutic goals. So it's not like therapy is like this one little sip in a glass. It's that we're wanting that the therapy really spreads throughout the child's experience until we meet a certain goal or whatever it is, and then maybe the therapeutic methods and tools will change, and the goals as well. So one of the ways, because I do feel like the far majority of the time the issues are not around handling necessarily, they're not necessarily around the goals. I think that often therapists, teachers, everybody working in the team can agree on the goal, but the dilemma is often around the actual implementation, so the methods and the tools. So for example, a lot of the recommendations that might be given from any kind of therapist for a child within a school setting will be around things that are done within either a small group or done one-on-one. And the feedback often from the teachers is like, this is just not possible. Like, we have X amount of children in our class and we have X amount of hours that we do small group, and I can't restructure the whole classroom. So I don't actually think that restructuring classrooms is always a terrible thing. Sometimes it is good to teach old dogs new tricks, like to, rustle up the way that we do things. But sometimes it also is honestly and legitimately just not something that is possible to do within that setting. So this is when we need to come back to the drawing board as a team, as the parent, as the teacher, as the therapist, and also do this without the child present. This is not something that children need to hear about. There's often a deep association of like a lot of misunderstanding that children receive when they are hearing about their therapy protocols and things like this. So we want to have these conversations just in adult spaces, and not like put on our children too much of that like responsibility within the therapy setting. So we want to come back to the drawing board, have a conversation, and also look within those conversations on what other tools we can pull on. Whether it is a season where an assistant comes within the preschool setting that the parent is possibly paying for, possibly there is some kind of government assistance that will also support that. We want to look at any creative solutions that therapists can give around how to implement these tools for the teachers and understanding the setting that they're in more. So I hope that this helps. I hope that it's given you a bit of a bigger picture on the dynamic between all of the people that operate around these children, and a bit of a clearer understanding of the kind of trajectory or space that therapy occupies for different children. And before we really make any decisions, let's count the cost of how valuable this experience can be for children, and truly it can be. Now, before you go, I want you to drop for me any questions that you have or any troubleshooting areas that this might have come up for you, whether you are a teacher or a parent or even a therapist that has experienced the other side of this. Drop them down below. I would love to hear from you and interact with you on this. I'll chat to you down there.